So as we saw in the last section, Lenin had been shipped by the Germans from Switzerland into Russia in April of 1917 to try and stir up further discontent. And from the German point of view, they were hoping that he would help take Russia out of the war. Lenin, on arriving in Russia, encouraged the Bolsheviks to try and create their own revolution. In July 1917, the Bolsheviks did indeed attempt a revolution, albeit one that they almost immediately aborted because they were afraid it wouldn't succeed. But this was simply preparing the ground for their eventual takeover of power in October of 1917. October in the Russian calendar. This actually took place in November in the calendar that was being used in Europe. So, in Russian cities, as we already saw in Petrograd in particular, there was a Soviet, that is a workers' council holding power, or at least claiming to hold power. Soviets had also been set up in other cities across Russia as well. And as the provisional government under Kerensky became increasingly unpopular because of the hardships that the war continued to bring, more and more of these Soviets began demanding that the provincial government resign and to be replaced by a government elected by the Soviets themselves. And the Bolshevik motto was that all power to the Soviets, that in other words the provincial government should be ignored and only the Soviets treated as the legitimate basis of authority in Russia. And in October 1917, Lenin again urged the Bolsheviks that now is the moment of opportunity to stage our revolution. Lenin was aware that the majority of the Russian population was not necessarily in agreement with Bolshevik policies, but he calculated that most of the Russian population wouldn't object or wouldn't try and stop the Bolsheviks from seizing power either, that the provisional government had become so unpopular they wanted to get rid of it, and this largely proved to be correct. So in October 1917, the Bolsheviks attacked the Winter Palace in Petrograd. The Winter Palace is where the provisional government was meeting. They forced the provisional government to surrender and effectively took control of Petrograd, the capital city of Russia, and quite quickly seized control of the other major urban centers in Russia, including Moscow. So essentially the Bolsheviks had succeeded in taking power exactly as Lenin had predicted, that the conditions were right for a socialist takeover. And initially this was kind of welcomed by a lot of people. They promised the workers better pay, better working conditions. They promised the peasants of Russia that they would have land and food. They promised the soldiers they would withdraw from the war. And so the Bolsheviks hoped that they would essentially be given a democratic mandate to vote. They also promised independence to the various nationalist groups in Russia. They organized new elections for January 1918, but to their surprise, they actually failed to win a majority. They only won about 29% of the vote. The radical socialists, who were kind of more moderate than the Bolsheviks, actually won a majority, and therefore the Bolsheviks decided to abandon the elections, to cancel the elections. They were the last real free elections to be held in Russia under socialist control. New elections were held, but this time only candidates who belonged to the Bolshevik party could run. They did introduce universal suffrage, which included women. So this was socialist Russia was one of the first countries to have universal suffrage for both men and women. But of course, all candidates had to be from the Communist Party, which meant that there was very little real input on the elections. And the socialist government under Lenin begins taking steps to consolidate control. They also begin. So what did the socialists do? Well, the first thing they do is they abolish private property. They take over most of the main industries in Russia, and they promise that they're going to create a new state, in which the ordinary industrial workers and the ordinary peasants will have much better lives. However, the first step to this in the Russian mind in Lenin's mind, is to make peace with Germany. So in early 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which takes Russia out of the First World War, at enormous consequence to Russian territory. So basically the Russians are forced to give up about a quarter of their territory in what we call European Russia or Western Russia, including some of the most fertile land, some of the most industrialized parts of Russia. I'll show you a map in a second that the Germans really did take a big chunk of Russia by the terms of this treaty, and it's always worth bearing that in mind, that when we talk about the harshness with which the Germans were treated in the Treaty of Versailles, that when the shoe was on the other foot and the Germans had the advantage over the Russians in 1918, they weren't exactly slow to take full advantage of Russia in that situation. So let's just have a little look at the map. So this is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. As you can see, the areas in the kind of burgundy and blue color were parts of Russia that were taken by Germany and Austria. So I want to show you a little video just to give you some kind of insight into the Russian revolutions of 1917.
People's Army, all members of the aristocracy are to be arrested. Take him away.
We are the People's Army. All members of the aristocracy are to be arrested.
But comrades, I'm People's Army too.
You expect us to believe that? Take him away.
The mellow taste of Smirnoff Black.
We are People's Army. All members of the aristocracy.
Imperial Russia's best kept secret.
Okay, so today's lecture brought to you by Smirnoff Black. That was just a commercial that was on TV when I was younger. I always thought it was a kind of funny way of, but also making the point that the kind of revolutionary chaos that was created in Russia in 1917 with different groups seizing power and no one really kind of sure who was in charge. Okay, not surprising, such dramatic changes in Russian society, the abolishment of private property, the creation of universal suffrage with one political party, produced dramatic opposition as well. And what quickly followed in early 1918 was what we call the Russian Civil War between the White Army, who represented various different groups, and the Bolshevik Red Army. And so the Russian Civil War was fought for the next 2 years, quite a brutal conflict. Who were the White Army? Who was involved with the White Army? It was actually quite an eclectic mix of different groups who were only united by the fact that they hated the Bolsheviks. So we have loyal czars, those who wanted to restore the czars to power, and actually the Russian Bolshevik government executed the czar and the Russian royal family in July of 1918. Landlords, not surprisingly, hated the abolishment of private property, as did big businessmen. Liberals, who certainly wanted a democratic government, but did not want the kind of socialist centralized government that the Bolsheviks were trying to create. And then various nationalist leaders who wanted to break away from the Russian control of their homelands, that the Bolsheviks had promised that they would grant referendums to various nationalities, but quite quickly showed in 1918 that they really weren't willing to do that. Interestingly, the White Army was also aided by the Allies. That is, the Allies who were fighting in the First World War. So while the Russian Civil War was going on, of course, the First World War was still taking place as well. And the Allies actually sent troops to Russia to try and help the Whites in order to, with the hope that they would try and bring Russia back into the war. And so, you probably didn't know this, but from 1918 to 1919, about 13,000 American troops served in Russia, helping the Whites in trying to defeat the Bolsheviks. So it's kind of the White Army are powerful in terms of there's lots of different groups involved, but there's no kind of centralized single goal they have in mind, and then that probably contributes to their defeat. Because the Whites don't have a kind of unified goal, lots of them want lots of different things. It's hard for them to have a common strategy, a common goal. The war was also marked by great brutality. The Bolsheviks set up labor camps, incarcerated those people who they suspected of being disloyal, and were quite brutal with people in terms of executing people who they suspected were directly aiding the Whites. The Whites, similarly, I think in the textbook it talks about how they loaded up trainloads of dead Bolsheviks and shipped them off to starving Bolshevik cities with the message free fresh meat on the side of the train. So a very, very nasty conflict. But in the end, it's the Bolsheviks who were able to win through massive mobilization, brutal repression of their enemies. So by 1922, all of the White Armies are essentially defeated and the Russian Civil War is brought to an end, although really by 1920, the Bolsheviks had got on top and had established themselves as the dominant power in Russia. I'll talk more about what those mass mobilizations involved in a second. Student musings. So the Civil War team colours were red and white. Nearly everyone breathed a sigh of relief when the communists were able to restore chaos. So the communists won the war, and as this student says, they restore chaos in Russia. However, the communists actually had to change tactics in order to do it. They had to introduce a policy that became known as war communism. Lenin basically said that in order to win the war, we need to kind of abandon some of our communist principles in order to defeat the white. And what that essentially meant was they had promised all these reforms to the ordinary working class, industrial working class, and the ordinary peasants of Russia, and they immediately go back in those and actually treat the ordinary people of Russia quite strictly, quite brutally, in order to achieve victory over the whites. The first thing they established a secret police, the Cheka, who were notorious for hunting for informers, for rooting out potential traitors, for executing people without any kind of due process, and for suppressing any kind of dissent amongst the Russian population. War communism also called for the Bolsheviks to seize control of every industry in Russia. They run all the transport industries, they run all the banks, and they seize all the crops from the Russian farmers produce and redistribute them to feed the armies, to feed the cities. Strikes are made illegal, obviously very ironic, given that communism is supposed to be about the revolution of the working classes. They made strikes illegal. They requisitioned agricultural products. They introduced mandatory labor for various people. So in some ways, this almost seemed like old-style Russian serfdom in the name of achieving a communist victory. They also introduced rationing as well, very strict rationing. So actually very, very heavy state control of all aspects of the economy, geared towards winning the war, and with kind of little regard for the individual rights of the Russian workers or the Russian peasants. And this policy ultimately helps the Russians win, or helps the Bolsheviks win the war, win the civil war. But not surprisingly, it produces a great deal of anger amongst the peasants and workers. The peasants and workers thought, you guys promised us free bread, new land, greater rights, greater working conditions, greater pay, and in some ways you were much worse in terms of the conditions you imposed upon us than even the old Tsarist regime had been. And so in 1921, Lenin, in kind of recognition of this, changes gears once again and introduces something called a new economic policy. Basically, he says in order for communism to succeed in Russia, we need to recover the Russian economy first. And in order to allow the Russian economy to recover, and huge amount of irony here, we have to reintroduce some aspects of capitalism. So we're going to reintroduce capitalism temporarily to allow the Russian economy to recover, and then when it has sufficiently recovered, we will remove capitalism once more and return to full-on socialism. So what exactly did capitalism mean? It certainly didn't mean full-scale, free market economics. The Russian state retained control over most of the large industries in Russia, or in the Soviet Union, as it now became known. The Soviet Union was a union of the various socialist republics. So basically what the Bolsheviks did was they gave all the various nationalities of Russia their own independent state, or their own state, their own republics. But then, of course, they ensured that those republics remained under the control of Moscow. So the Soviet Union was supposed to be different from the old Russian Empire in that it was a union of willing republics who were joining of their own free will. But in reality, it was a facade in which the old Russian Empire continued to function, albeit under the illusion that each nationality had its own republic. New economic policy. The Soviet Union would retain control over most of the large industries, but small industries, small business owners would be allowed to emerge, and peasants would be allowed, after they had provided for the needs of the Russian state, would be allowed to sell any of their surplus on the open market. So under Lenin, the new economic policy reintroduced a measure of capitalism into the Soviet Union in order to try and rebuild its economy after the ravages of the First World War, then the Russian Civil War. And so the idea being that the economy needs to recover first, and once the economy does recover, then we can work towards introducing full socialism again.